On the night of September 21st, 1973, two men drove an old Cadillac hearse to Los Angeles International Airport. They were wearing suits, which was unusual for them, because neither of them was the kind of man who normally wore suits. They walked up to the cargo desk and told the attendant they were there to collect a body. The attendant couldn't find the transfer paperwork, but assumed it was a last-minute change and let them through anyway. One of the men signed the release form. He wrote his name as Jeremy Nobody. They loaded the coffin into the back of the hearse and drove east into the Mojave Desert toward the Joshua Tree National Monument, 2 hours from Los Angeles on a road that goes nowhere in particular. When they arrived, they dragged the coffin out into the desert and poured 5 gallons of gasoline into it. Then they threw a match. Campers nearby saw the fire and called the police, who found the burning coffin and identified it as belonging to Gram Parsons, a musician who had died 2 days earlier at the age of 26 in a motel room a few miles away. The men were arrested, but there was no law at the time against stealing a body, so they were charged only with theft of the coffin itself and fined a total of $1,300. One of them later said dying was a great career move for Gram. He was not wrong, because in the years that followed, the world finally began to understand what Gram Parsons had done, what he had built and invented and given away for free, while the people around him got rich and famous on the back of his ideas. This is his story. Gram Parsons was born on the 5th of November 1946 in Winter Haven, Florida, into a family that had more money than it knew how to handle and more tragedy than money could fix. His father, Coon Dog Connor, was a decorated World War II veteran who had come home from the war and slowly come apart inside it, drinking heavily through Gram's early childhood, becoming an alcoholic in the specific Southern way that looks like charm and hospitality until it doesn't anymore. On Christmas Day, 1958, when Gram was 12 years old, his father shot himself in the head with a shotgun. The family covered it up. The official story was heart failure. Gram grew up knowing the truth, but not allowed to speak it, carrying a secret that shaped everything about the way he would later write about loneliness and loss, and the particular American heartbreak of people who have everything and feel nothing. His mother, Avis, remarried quickly, a businessman named Bob Parsons, who gave Gram and his sister his surname and took control of the family's considerable fortune. Avis began to drink the way her first husband had drunk. She died of alcoholism in 1965 on the day of Gram's high school graduation, leaving behind 2 children, a significant estate, and a stepfather who would spend the next several years trying to get his hands on it. Gram was 18 years old when his mother died. He had already been playing music for 6 years, guitar and piano, country and gospel, everything he could find on the radio in the Florida night. And music was the only thing that made consistent sense to him in a family that kept falling apart around him. He enrolled at Harvard University in the autumn of 1965, officially to study theology. In practice, he was there to play music, take LSD, and figure out what he believed. He lasted 1 semester. Then he dropped out and drove south and never looked back. Gram Parsons had a phrase for what he was trying to make: cosmic American music. It was not a genre, it was not a marketing term. It was his description of something he heard in his head that did not yet exist. A music that took the honesty of country, the energy of rock and roll, the depth of gospel, and the freedom of folk, and refused to choose between them. In 1967, he formed a band called the International Submarine Band, and recorded an album called Safe at Home, one of the first rock albums to use Nashville session musicians and pedal steel guitar without apology, without irony, without treating country music as a joke or a novelty. The album sold almost nothing, but it reached the right ears. In early 1968, Gram Parsons was invited to join the Byrds, one of the most important bands in America at the time, the group that had turned Bob Dylan songs into folk rock anthems and sold millions of records doing it. He was 21 years old. He had been in the band for approximately 5 months when they recorded Sweetheart of the Rodeo, an album that is now widely considered the first true country rock record and one of the most important albums in the history of American music. Gram pushed the Byrds away from psychedelic rock and toward country music, toward Merle Haggard and Hank Williams and the Bakersfield sound, toward honest songs about real things, away from the abstraction and experimentation that had defined their previous albums. The existing members resisted at first. Then they listened. Then they recorded the album his way. Then, when they were scheduled to tour South Africa, Gram refused to go, citing his opposition to apartheid, an unusual position for a Southern musician in 1968, and left the band. He had been a Byrd for 5 months. The album he had shaped would be cited as a primary influence by virtually every major country rock act that followed. The Eagles, Poco, Pure Prairie League, Linda Ronstadt, and 100 others who took Gram's blueprint and built careers on it. After leaving the Byrds, Gram Parsons formed the Flying Burrito Brothers with fellow Byrd Chris Hillman, a band that took everything Sweetheart of the Rodeo had suggested and committed to it completely. Their debut album, The Gilded Palace of Sin, released in 1969, was unlike anything else being released at the time. Country music played with rock energy, gospel harmonies, pedal steel guitar, and lyrics that dealt directly with drugs and sin and redemption without sentimentality or shame. Gram performed in a rhinestone-studded nudie suit covered in marijuana leaves and naked women, a deliberate, joyful provocation aimed at Nashville's conservatism, a declaration that country music could contain everything, including everything Nashville thought it shouldn't. The album sold fewer than 40,000 copies, but the people who heard it included Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, who became one of Gram's closest friends and most devoted students. Richards later said that Gram showed him a version of American music that he had never understood before. The deep country, the gospel, the Bakersfield sound, the music that predated rock and roll and would outlast it. The influence ran both directions. Gram's increasing friendship with Richards introduced him to heroin, which would eventually become the thing that killed him. And Gram's influence on Richards shaped some of the most important music the Rolling Stones ever made. The country flavorings on Sticky Fingers, the whole atmosphere of exile on Main Street, which Gram partly attended during its recording at Keith's villa in the south of France. Gram spent a significant portion of 1971 at Nelcote, Richards' rented villa in the south of France, while the Stones recorded Exile. He contributed little to the actual recordings, spending most of his time consuming drugs and quarreling with his girlfriend. He was eventually asked to leave by Anita Pallenberg, Keith's partner, who had reached her limit of house guests, who didn't know when they weren't wanted. Meanwhile, the Flying Burrito Brothers had dissolved around Gram's unreliability. His drug use had made him impossible to depend on, missing rehearsals, missing shows, disappearing for days. The band fired him before their second album was finished. In late 1971, Gram Parsons was back in the United States, pursuing a solo career, looking for a harmony singer who could match what he heard in his head. A mutual friend suggested a young folk singer named Emmylou Harris, who was playing small clubs in Washington, D.C., a divorced single mother living off food stamps between gigs, virtually unknown outside the small circuit of venues that booked that kind of music. Gram went to see her play. He asked her to move to Los Angeles and record with him. She said yes. What happened next in the studio and on the road was one of the great musical partnerships in American history. Two voices that fit together so perfectly that listeners often couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. A harmony so natural it sounded less like performance than like breathing. They recorded his first solo album, GP, in 1972. With Elvis Presley's touring band providing the backing, a deliberate choice by Gram, who wanted the most authoritative country sound he could find and knew exactly where to look for it. The album was released in January 1973. It received respectful reviews. It sold modestly. It did not make Gram Parsons famous in the way his talent deserved. He went back into the studio almost immediately, recording the album that would be released after his death as Grievous Angel, by wide critical consensus, his masterpiece. Emmylou's harmonies on that record are some of the most beautiful vocal performances in country music history. Gram sounds on the best tracks like a man who has finally found the sound he had been hearing in his head for years and is singing directly into it. He finished recording in the summer of 1973. He was 26 years old. He had a European tour booked, a new album ready for release, and for the first time in his career, the sense that something was about to change. He went to Joshua Tree to celebrate. Joshua Tree was Gram's favorite place in the world, a vast alien landscape of twisted rock formations and desert sky, 2 hours east of Los Angeles, where the Mojave meets the Colorado Desert and the light does things that don't happen anywhere else. He had been going there since the late 1960s, often with Keith Richards, sometimes with friends, occasionally alone, to sit in the desert at night and look at the stars and whatever else was out there. Earlier in 1973, at the funeral of Clarence White, a guitarist and friend who had been killed by a drunk driver, Gram had told his road manager, Phil Coffin, "If I go, don't let them take me back. Take me out to Joshua Tree and burn me in the desert. Promise me." Coffin had promised. He didn't think he would have to keep it. Gram checked into the Joshua Tree Inn on the 15th of September, 1973, with a small group of friends. He spent the days in the desert and the nights at the local bars, drinking and taking whatever was available, which in September 1973 in that part of California was considerably more than it should have been. On the evening of the 18th of September, someone injected him with morphine. The exact circumstances have never been fully established, and the person responsible has never been publicly identified. Gram Parsons stopped breathing in the early hours of September 19, 1973, in room 8 of the Joshua Tree Inn. He was taken to High Desert Memorial Hospital, where he was declared dead on arrival at 12:15 in the morning. The official cause of death was morphine and alcohol overdose. He was 26 years old. His body was sent to Los Angeles International Airport to be flown to Louisiana for burial, as his family had arranged. That was when Phil Coffin and his friend Michael Martin drove up in the Cadillac hearse, signed the release form as Jeremy Nobody, and took Gram Parsons back to the desert he had loved. The fire burned for most of the night. When the police found what remained, they could identify the body only by a ring on the left hand that his family had requested remain with him. Room 8 at the Joshua Tree Inn is still available to rent. It is decorated as a shrine to Gram Parsons. There is usually a waiting list. Gram Parsons released 2 solo albums in his lifetime. He was a member of the Byrds for 5 months and the Flying Burrito Brothers for less than 2 years. He was never a mainstream star. He never had a hit single. He never sold out an arena. But the world he built around him while he was alive became, after his death, one of the most influential foundations in American popular music. The Eagles, Glenn Frey, Don Henley, Bernie Leadon had been part of the Los Angeles country rock scene that Gram shaped. Bernie Leadon had played with the Flying Burrito Brothers. Glenn Frey had watched Gram perform in the clubs of Los Angeles and understood, watching him, what he wanted to do with his own music. The Eagles went on to sell 150 million records. The Rolling Stones, through Keith Richards' friendship with Gram, had absorbed country music into their DNA. Wild Horses, Dead Flowers, Country Honk, the whole atmosphere of exile on Main Street, carrying the fingerprints of what Gram had shown Keith in the years they spent together. Emmylou Harris went on to become one of the most celebrated country artists of her generation, winning 14 Grammy Awards, being inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, building a 50-year career on the foundation she and Gram had laid together in 2 years of recording and touring. Her 1975 album, Pieces of the Sky, recorded 2 years after Gram's death, was the beginning of a solo career that would last decades. She has said in dozens of interviews over many years that she has never fully recovered from losing him. Grievous Angel, the album Gram finished in the summer of 1973, was released posthumously in January 1974. It was reviewed as a masterpiece. It reached number 195 on the Billboard chart. The music industry, which had never known what to do with Gram Parsons while he was alive, did not know what to do with him dead either. But the musicians knew. They have always known. There is a direct line from Gram Parsons to the Eagles, and Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris, and the whole Americana movement that emerged in the 1990s. Wilco, Son Volt, Ryan Adams, Lucinda Williams. Every artist who believed that country music and rock music were not enemies and didn't need to choose. Keith Richards, writing about Gram for Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 100 greatest artists in 2005, said that Parsons' recorded output was minimal, but that his effect on country music is enormous. And this is why we're talking about him now. He was 26 years old when he died. He had been making music seriously for less than a decade, and the world he created in that time is still being lived in by millions of people who have never heard his name. If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more of them, and not one of them ordinary.